My name is Kelsey Klotz. I'm a lecturer at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte in the Department of Music. And I want to thank John for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be sharing my work with you. I think we'll just sort of start off the bat with the question of, this is a work on Dave Brubeck and sort of thinking about why whiteness, why this particular lens for this book. Really, when I was thinking about what I wanted to write about, I was thinking about the history of the jazz field. So the long history of sort of jazz history and historians is sort of populated with a lot of white critics and white historians describing primarily kind of Black jazz musicians. And what happened when they did that was they ended up, and as you'll see as I get further into the presentation, they ended up sort of describing those Black jazz musicians in ways of, in terms of sort of natural talent or primitivism or sort of emotional output rather than sort of their intellect and efforts. And so there was this way of inscribing race into thinking about their music. And that's been a legacy of over 100 years at this point that's sort of taking decades to undo. And what a lot of jazz historians have done in trying to sort of work through and kind of figure out that work is they focused on sort of Blackness and Black jazz musicians, and that's left whiteness as being sort of invisible, unnamed, and unable to be identified. So basically the work that I'm presenting today partially shares the goal of much of the now 30-year-old field of critical whiteness studies, which is to reveal and deconstruct whiteness in its myriad forms. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna put on a do not disturb on my computer. So in the 1950s, there existed sort of only a limited language to distinguish white culture and whiteness, even though Black writers across the 20th century, from W.E.B. Du Bois to Ralph Ellison to James Baldwin, were actively creating ways of describing whiteness. But nevertheless, even despite this very long history of describing whiteness, making whiteness visible continues to be an important part of critical whiteness studies. So scholars like Sarah Ahmed, Bell Hooks, and George Yancey argue that though whiteness remains invisible to many white people, people of color see whiteness and experience the negative manifestations of white privilege daily, whether that's through overt acts of racism, legacies of racist policies, or microaggressions. So while white supremacy in some ways may seem today more and more visible with every passing headline, whether it's intentional or not, whiteness sort of remains unacknowledged by many white people. So when I was sort of coming into this book and into this research, one big influence was what have jazz scholars sort of already been doing. A second big influence is that this book comes out of the research I did for my dissertation while I was at Washington University in St. Louis. So I worked on my dissertation from about 2013 to 2016. So much of it was in the height and aftermath of the Ferguson uprising following the murder of Michael Brown in the summer of 2014. That was just a few miles from WashU and from where I was living. And sort of something that I couldn't get away from, like as I was reaching, was proximity, that in some ways I was so geographically close to what was happening, and yet in some ways very, very far in terms of living in a deeply segregated city and being on a campus that was virtually untouched by the protests that were sort of happening in many other areas or throughout the city, including on other college campuses in the city. So as I began work on the book and imagined how the dissertation might be transformed, the dissertation focused on Brubeck, but it also looked at like the modern jazz quartet and Miles Davis and other artists. I recognized that sort of writing another book on jazz and race that forefronted Blackness didn't really feel right. It didn't feel like something that anyone needed from another white author in 2018 when I was sort of initially conceiving of this. So that inevitably led to a focus on whiteness. So, in my work, I theorize a performance of whiteness to be the spoken and unspoken rules, behaviors, and speech acts by white people that are defined and redefined by white people over the course of centuries. These behaviors and acts constantly recirculate as habits built through collective performances created in the interactions between ourselves, the self, identities that we decide to be like ourselves, and other identities. A performance of race understands the racialized body or the racialized institution as the site of legacies of behaviors and acts rather than a closed system. So as James Baldwin emphasizes, quote, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." So too is the performance of whiteness a historical performance that is embodied and constantly replayed in the present. So the book sort of follows many performances that center on Brubeck. It's not just sort of his performance of whiteness that I'm looking at. It's really using him as a lens to understand what's happening in mid-century America in the 1950s and 60s. So I look at critics and audiences and music industry executives and sort of the decisions and the behaviors and the things that they're saying. So this is sort of a chapter overview. There's some of these that are bolded. Those ones I'm going to do like brief case studies just to share with you. But the first chapter is really focused on jazz critics. The second chapter looks at Dave Brubeck's conversion of new audiences to jazz. So folks who thought that jazz was sort of not proper, but then Brubeck kind of came around and suddenly it was sort of respectable. Chapter 3 looks at mainstream magazine's portrayal of Brubeck, so specifically looking at Time magazine and comparing their coverage of Brubeck to their coverage of Black musicians on the cover of Time. In chapter 4, this is looking at Brubeck's own anti-racist actions in 1960, which we'll talk about in this talk in a little bit. And it's sort of in the context of the music industry's ambivalence toward segregation. And then chapter 5 really follows a cantata that Brubeck wrote in the late 1960s called The Gates of Justice. And this was a piece that Brubeck composed that was intended to bring Black and Jewish communities together at this point in the late civil rights movement. So I'm going to, in this talk, share sort of little pieces of some of my favorite parts of the book. So this is going to be a little piece from chapter 1, which really gets into the music, a little piece from chapter 2 that is legitimately my favorite case study, and then a little piece from chapter 4 in thinking about Brubeck's music down south. So let's dig into those case studies. So chapter 1 is really asking this question of what does whiteness sound like? Now, it doesn't suggest that whiteness has its own sort of sound just sort of naturally. It's really thinking about how that sound has been constructed by people in how they talk about the sound and the language that they use about the sound. So whiteness research generally focuses on the looks and processes of whiteness, and I do that too. But a fundamental argument that this book builds on is that people make assumptions about sound that are about race. So one of the folks that I really look at is Jennifer Lynn Stover, who theorizes something called the sonic color line. She writes that the sonic color line produces, codes, and polices racial difference through the ear, enabling us to hear race as well as see it. And chapter 1 really deals with music critics because they were sort of the first line of translation for sound to readers and to audiences in the 1950s. And so how they wrote about Brubeck's sound is really important to how folks were able to interpret his sound. And so what I argue is that they were essentially writing whiteness into descriptions of his sound. And this is also drawing on another scholar's work. This is American Studies scholar John Gennari, and he explains these critics' importance to future understandings of jazz. He writes, quote, "The meanings we attach to the music and the musicians, how we make sense of what we hear and see and feel, are very deeply influenced by the filters that stand between us and the sound that comes out of the musicians' bodies and instruments." So basically what he's saying is that kind of narratives or things that are written about jazz coded particular sounds as white, and then that impacted the way that audiences understood the musicians and their music. So from the beginning of his career, critics positioned Brubeck within the cool school, so cool jazz, a genre of jazz that sort of now is overwhelmingly associated with whiteness. So in the 1950s, cool became a way for jazz critics to describe the new musical sounds they heard in jazz. In their publications and radio and television interviews, music critics were quick to list the following as musical definitions of cool. So orchestration, softer or quieter dynamic levels, vibrato-less sounds, an emphasis on shorter melodic phrases and more space in improvised lines. And so all of these elements became sort of sonic signifiers for cool's kind of control and emotional detachment. So both jazz critics and mainstream music critics often understood these types of techniques as originating in European classical music. Brubeck quickly became a central feature in coverage of cool jazz. So in the early to mid 1950s, as Brubeck's career began sort of a steep ascent, critics' descriptions of his music began to take a familiar pattern. They recognized his studies with the classical composer Darius Milhaud. They mentioned his partnership with saxophonist Paul Desmond and their success in performing colleges across the country. And then sort of invariably, they would describe his music in relation to European classical music. So often critics connected Brubeck's sort of intellectual exercises to European classical music through specific musical devices, and most notably something called counterpoint. Counterpoint is basically how different musical lines are set or composed with one another. It's how those different musical lines are both independent from one another, they could be played separately, and also how they're sort of interdependent and sort of create harmonies when you do them together. And I'm going to play an example of sort of the person that a lot of people sort of highlight as being the best composer of counterpoint, and that is Johann Sebastian Bach. I'm going to play just a little excerpt of a fugue, which is going to be a fugue is a sort of musical piece with a lot of very complex rules. But I'm going to play just a little excerpt of that so we have it in our ears before we get into the Brubeck. All right, so just a little bit of that. So we're thinking about independent lines, but also how they sort of mingle and mix together. So when we think about Brubeck, the Brubeck quartet often is sort of described in these terms of using counterpoint. And often what they're doing, sometimes that counterpoint is sort of prearranged, pre-written, they've already planned it. Sometimes that counterpoint is improvised. So he and Paul Desmond are sort of improvising together their own lines, but creating this counterpoint, this play between the lines. So I'm going to play an example of one of my favorite examples, and one that a lot of people pointed to in the time period. This is The Way You Look Tonight from the Jazz at Oberlin album. And what you'll hear is sort of Paul Desmond on saxophone leading off a little bit, and then Brubeck will come in, and he kind of sounds a little bit like he's following Desmond, letting Desmond kind of have the main play. And then at a certain point, they'll sort of switch and Brubeck will become the leader. So here is a little bit of that counterpoint. right. So in addition to sort of having critics talk quite a bit about this kind of counterpoint and really compare Brubeck to Johann Sebastian Bach. So his music gets called Bachian, gets called sort of Bach jazzed up. They talk about it in terms of it being sort of fugue-ish. So this is another example. This is Look for the Silver Lining. And this is one where a critic specifically says like, hey, it sounds fugue-ish. So remember, I just played a fugue for you at the beginning of this. That was the first example. And this is sort of the piece that gets that sort of, oh, this sounds a little bit like a fugue. So here is Look for the Silver Lining. All right. So again, Brubeck's getting all of this sort of attention. He's getting described in terms of European classical music, particularly in terms of sort of playing counterpoint. But there's also another jazz group at the same time period that the Brubeck Quartet is coming up, called the Modern Jazz Quartet, who also does some similar things to what Brubeck does. So the Modern Jazz Quartet is an all-Black group featuring John Lewis, Milt Jackson, Percy Heath, and Connie Kay. And they also featured quite a bit of counterpoint in a number of original compositions and arrangements in the same time period. So for example, this is an original composition of John Lewis, the pianist, and this is, Vendôme is a fugue. So I've used that word a couple of times. I've even used the word fugue-ish. What Johann Sebastian Bach was composing in the piece that I played for you is a fugue. What that means, fugues are very complicated musical compositions that have a set kind of formula for how you have to go about it. So you'll see in this sort of confusing looking thing, there's something called an exposition. In that exposition, you have to have someone give the main theme. So the subject, the vibraphone, is giving the main theme. And then you have to have someone sort of respond to that. And while that response is happening, you have to have sort of a counter subject. And there are all kinds of rules about what note that has to start on and sort of what key area it goes in. It's a very complicated thing. The best description of a fugue that I have ever seen is in The Glass Onion, about somewhere toward the beginning of the piece. There's a very famous, I don't want to spoil it to you because it was such a wonderful moment, but there's a very famous sort of cameo appearance, and that person explains a fugue very well. So if you want to have that, it's there for you on Netflix. So while the Brubeck Quartet's improvised counterpoint sort of simply occupied a solo chorus, the MJQ actually often created compositions and arrangements that integrated counterpoint within the form of the piece. But even when critics noted that, oh, John Lewis has a big attention to form, he seems to really care about form, they never specifically referred to Vendôme as a fugue or discuss John Lewis's ability to compose fugues. Further, while the all-Black modern jazz quartet was often compared to the Brubeck Quartet, critics tended not to actually compare them to Johann Sebastian Bach or really any other classical composer for that matter, even when John Lewis directly quoted pieces by Bach in their performances. So this is a recording of the Modern Jazz Quartet's arrangement of the song Softly as in a Morning Sunrise. And this piece and the introduction features a canon taken directly from Johann Sebastian Bach's musical offering. So this is the introduction to the melody of Softly as in a Morning Sunrise. So again, they are not, that is not pointed out as sounding Bachian or fuguish or like, oh, look at that amazing counterpoint, or even like, oh, they just lifted Bach and put it in a jazz piece. That none of that was sort of in that commentary about the modern jazz quartet. So again, the modern jazz quartet's music wasn't described using these terms from classical music or compared to Bach, and it wouldn't be for decades. Instead, it was Brubeck's music that was written up in reviews that were often laden with Western classical musical jargon. So this is a longer sort of excerpt. This comes from Time magazine, and this is sort of a prominent example. So I'm going to let you read it, and I'll play the piece that this is meant to describe. So it's meant to describe an early performance of Let's Fall in Love. So that the fact that white critics would consider Black musicians' primary musical contributions to be jazz rather than classical music stems from a legacy of European and American reliance on Cartesian dualisms, or we're going to put it more simply, a legacy of racist stereotypes. So when I'm talking about Cartesian dualisms, I am talking about the philosopher Descartes, the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." Cultural theorist Simon Frith argues that Western distinctions based on these problematic Cartesian dualisms would include things like seriousness versus fun, mind versus body, intellect versus physicality, that these types of binaries were a primary way that white critics and audiences understood the difference between white and Black musicians and their music throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Others have focused on deconstructing the link between Blackness and primitivism and rhythm in jazz, but in focusing on Brubeck, I can reveal those tacit understandings of some critics that white musicians, even white jazz musicians, had sort of a unique access to European classical musical techniques. And this, of course, doesn't mean that Black jazz musicians couldn't perform those techniques. The modern jazz quartet are a wonderful example of that very fact, but this is about who is recognized for having had that ability. So in the next section of the talk, we're going to see how that recognition of whose music can be considered classical or intellectual has further implications for musicians, their reputations, and their access to audiences and resources. So this is where we kind of look at what does whiteness do. We'll see in this section how musical intellect through classical music sort of gets mapped onto other positive traits and assigned to white jazz musicians like Brubeck as something unique to them as compared with Black jazz musicians. And here we're going to focus primarily on Respectability and Brubeck's women audiences. So in 1956, music editor George Merrick declared to the readership of Good Housekeeping magazine that jazz had become respectable. He cited the new spaces in which jazz could be found, and he outlined a shift of coming from within the genres and drew stark distinctions between old and new jazz performers. So he wrote, quote, "Jazz used to be the boy with dirty hands whom you wouldn't let come into your house. Jazz was born in the gin mills, the dubious night spots, the after-hour clubs of New Orleans, Chicago, and Kansas City, and now with clean hands is to be found in the concert halls, the music conservatories, and by way of respectable and carefully produced LP records in the nicest living rooms." So George Merrick makes fairly clear whose dirty hands were not allowed in the houses of Good Housekeeping's predominantly female and predominantly white female readers. He contributed to an emerging conversation that would become widely accepted, that when played by the right musicians, jazz is sort of pure, it's safe, it's intellectual, and in fact, it's even respectable. And sort of unsurprisingly, Brubeck was the key figure in George Merrick's identification of this new trend in jazz. Brubeck's classical sound signaled to this brand new jazz audience that his hands were impeccably clean, and that he portrayed the suburban living room as jazz's new home in a magazine targeted toward women suggests that what was especially new about jazz's audience was its gender. And Brubeck leaned into this new audience through advertisements and interviews that specifically showed his family. So critics and audiences tied the intellect that they heard into this newfound respectability. So here's a sort of interchange that was published in Woman's Home Companion in April 1955. So a writer for Woman's Home Companion asked their friends why Brubeck's piano was so sensational, and the responses were pretty much unanimous. One friend responded, "Brubeck's music is classically constructed jazz. Brubeck is a master of form, of structure. He's a contrapuntal improviser," there's that word again, "contrapuntal improviser of great talent." Another said, "Take away the rhythm bass and it sounds 17th century. The first agreed and added, "Not since Johann Sebastian Bach," name checking him again, "have we had someone who could improvise on a theme so creatively, so excitingly, within a proper structure." So they're using these terms that are laden with import from high art discourse and the European classical musical tradition to describe Brubeck's music. And by doing so, these women can demonstrate how Bach can serve as an entry point to Brubeck, both in terms of sort of musical value and respectability. And in doing so, middle and upper class white women had greater access to Brubeck's jazz than to other forms of jazz. And this was something that was particularly evident in the Dave Brubeck archive in the form of fan letters. So there were a lot of fan letters in the Dave Brubeck archive. And this is my favorite part, is sort of reading through these fan letters and how they're talking about Brubeck's music. So one woman wrote, her name was Clarine Sigg, and she self-identified as a 33-year-old housewife and mother of 6 lovely children, and describes her musical interest in terms of her passion and distraction from daily troubles and chores. She writes, quote, "I sit and play for hours and not having any sense of time passing. Besides having the thrill and satisfaction of playing, my troubles and worries go right out of the windows, which makes me feel that our world isn't such a bad place to live in at any time." So in writing this, she's essentially reflecting what American Studies scholar Gavin James Campbell describes about women's musical ambitions as basically the, quote, tormented struggle between personal ambition and wifely duty. I have some more advertisements for you as well. But Jacqueline Storick was another. She wrote a very several page long letter. Storick explained that she desired advice and help as she considered a turn toward composition herself. But she wasn't asking for help from Brubeck composer to composer. She actually spends most of her letter, a full page, focusing on the music business and detailing her connections to musicians who are willing to perform her songs and men in A&R departments. And she asks him about what percentage she should split with musicians recording her songs for demos. If his old record label has an A&R man she could send demos to, and if the music market really is as tough as they say. And so Brubeck is actually someone she can make a business connection with. What's also interesting about Stork's letter is that she positions herself as different from most women throughout her career. So she derides the musical tastes of, quote, mooning teenagers and fat dowagers who dabble in music, and then establishes herself within composition. And this is a creative realm that's usually, at this point, reserved for men. So even in the very beginning of her letter, she identifies as a housewife and a mother who plays Brubeck's music and explains, though I may not be unique in any other way, I bet the above statement can't be made by many. Anticipating Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, Stork prevails upon Brubeck to respond to her letter, writing, quote, if you could see me neglecting hundreds of domestic chores in favor of struggling over your arrangements of Foggy Day, Alamo, Frenesi, Gone with the Wind, etc., stopping the records and dashing to the piano, then in a rush of guilt, forcing myself to the grocery store and back to cook a meal, waiting for another chance to get back to the piano, I'm sure you would take a few minutes from your own busy life to reply. So as a housewife, Stork understands the duties that society expects her to fulfill, her domestic chores, but she also feels alone in her drive to create and sort of masculinizes her creativity. She writes, I'm just a woman who is plagued with a creative urge. None of my female friends has it. So in such explanations, Stork reinforces the sexist assumptions that granted musical value to fields dominated by men and sort of considered mass culture or sort of lower culture to be feminine. The last letter that I want to highlight is from a woman named Dottie Drummer. And so like Jacqueline Stork, Drummer positions her interest in music within her life as a housewife. She, quote, hopes to study piano and voice one of these days in between babies. She explains that Brubeck that his music and compositions have such a wonderful freedom to them that I can't help but be carried away and at times forget my motherly duties. And at the end of her letter, she expresses relief that she has finally shared her ideas about jazz and modern dance with him, writing, quote, I must confess I can once again breathe freely and get back to my chicken, one that's in the oven. Care to stop over? Her enthusiasm basically leaps off the page through her liberal use of exclamation marks and question marks. And one can only imagine her reaction to Brubeck's response, which validated her interest in composing music for modern dance. And then just a few years later, he did make the decision to compose a ballet titled Points on Jazz. So descriptions of Brubeck's intellect and respectability earned him a space in the American mainstream, in their publications and in their living rooms, on their college campuses. And that was space that was rarely offered to Black jazz musicians. But Brubeck's recognition came at a further cost to Black musicians who did make it in these spaces. So for this, I want to go back to Brubeck's influential Time magazine article. This was an article that he considered to be so definitive that when fans and early scholars wrote to him to ask for a biography, he suggested that they just look up this article. So the author of the article, T. George Harris, writes, quote, Brubeck is as untypical in the jazz field as a harp in a Dixieland combo. In a business that is known more than its share of dope and liquor, Brubeck rarely drinks, and after seriously and philosophically considering the possible value of mescaline, rejected the whole idea. While itinerant musicians are apt to dally with the bells along the way, Dave is happily married and has 4 children. 5th is on the way. Although a shady background was once almost essential to the seasoning of a real-life jazz man, Dave spent his youth playing nursemaid to heifers and earned his first money playing hymns in school. Characteristically, Dave has several priests among his friends. Brubeck is essentially the negative image of Harris's typical jazz musician, someone who consumes drug and alcohol, sleeps around with sort of nothing in the way of a family life, has a shady background, has little to no relationship with religion. And the racist connotations of each of these stereotypes is fairly clear. What visibly distinguishes Brubeck from other jazz musicians was his whiteness. So considering that many mainstream audiences believed the broader field of jazz to lack such traits of respectability, it's clear who benefited most from being part of a broader canon of European classical music. I have one last case study to share with you, and this one comes from Brubeck's 1960 tour, or kind of focuses on how Brubeck tries to make some change within this context. So in January 1960, Brubeck made headlines after 22 colleges and universities across the American South refused to allow his interracial quartet to perform. Initially, 11 of the schools backed out of their contracts with Brubeck when they learned that he and two other white musicians, saxophonist Paul Desmond and drummer Joe Morello, would be performing with African-American bassist Eugene Wright, who had joined the quartet 2 years earlier in 1958. After Brubeck informed the remaining 14 schools of Wright's presence in the quartet, 11 more insisted that Brubeck replace Wright with a white bassist, and thus we left only 3 willing to allow the integrated combo to perform. Those 3 were the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and Jacksonville University in Jacksonville, Florida. Brubeck refused to replace Eugene Wright, foregoing the $40,000 in revenue, which is worth, I have in my notes, nearly $400,000 today, but I'm pretty sure with inflation, we're over $400,000 today, that he would have received had he instead performed with a white bassist. Representatives of the various schools insisted one after the other that their cancellations of Brubeck's contracts were not based in prejudice, but on principle and policy. For the schools and their administrators, Brubeck simply broke his contract, and for Brubeck, contracts requiring segregation had no legal or moral basis. This is sort of the list of schools that I've been able to figure out that canceled and were part of this. Brubeck did not tend to keep canceled contracts in his archive, and I have not been able to find a list of all of the schools. By his 1960 Southern tour, Brubeck had long been considered a respectable jazz musician. So we've talked about this as a racially coded term, indicating that he was an acceptable choice for college campuses and concert halls, that he could bring new audiences to jazz. Critics and audiences were simply more likely to accept Brubeck as an intellectual, to accept his music as, quote, cerebral, to view him as having credentials within the sphere of classical music, and to view him as respectable because he was white. And this facilitated his entrance to spaces, including colleges around the country and segregated institutions in the South, and audiences which, as a jazz musician, he otherwise might not have had access. However, that same relationship to respectability and intellect that came with Brubeck's whiteness may also have had the side effect of making his protest all the more surprising to Southern universities and their administrators. So I want to just really briefly sort of outline some of his protests before that 1960 tour. He begins protesting actually in 1957. At this moment, he sort of quietly refuses to play for some segregated audiences. The integration crisis begins, and this is a moment where quite a few jazz musicians begin to step into civil rights protests. In 1958, he arrived to play at East Carolina College. The university told him that he couldn't play with Eugene Wright. Eugene Wright had literally just joined the group at this point. Brubeck refused to go on without Eugene Wright, and he waited until the dean of the college called the college president, who then called the North Carolina governor to see what they could do. Ultimately, they let them play as long as they kept Eugene Wright in the back, mainly because they'd already paid Brubeck. But also Brubeck didn't keep Eugene Wright in the back. He specifically said, no, go out in the front, your mic isn't working. So that happened. And then we have, he refused a lucrative offer to tour South Africa in 1958, because obviously with apartheid, they would not have allowed Eugene Wright to tour with them. The University of Georgia in 1959 is the first time that this sort of refusal for Brubeck to perform without Eugene Wright really sort of begins to impact his performance schedule. So a student group booked the quartet under the assumption that it was all white because it had previously been all white, but the promotional materials arrived and then they ultimately had to cancel. And that was one that Brubeck, I think the first one that Brubeck just flat out had to cancel and couldn't perform at. And then that led to the 1960 Southern Tour, when 22 out of 25 schools refused to allow Brubeck to play with Eugene Wright in an integrated ensemble. But Brubeck was undeterred, and he seems to have mounted a direct campaign for Southern audiences. He strongly believed that it wasn't the students' fault and that they wanted him to perform. So Brubeck has this quote after the tour was canceled. He says, quote, "Let me reiterate, we want to play in the South. Therefore, we appeal to them to help us." So to help with that, he recorded 2 albums back to back full of Southern songs. So we have Gone with the Wind, recorded in 1959, and Southern Scene, which was recorded in 1959 and released in 1960. The quartet members each specifically chose popular Southern songs, and these included well-known minstrel and parlor songs, jazz standards, mainstream hits, and 19th century spirituals and plantation songs, alongside a few popular songs that are written by white composers, but from the perspective of Black musicians. And nearly all of the songs performed across both albums had been performed by popular musicians like Bing Crosby, Ray Charles, Julie London, and Frank Sinatra, as well as jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, and Sarah Vaughan, and Miles Davis. So Brubeck has his song choices that are sort of sending positive messages of integration, but also the album covers make sort of the most clear case that we are actually an integrated group. So we are not going to try to trick you into thinking otherwise. So we have Gone with the Wind, which kind of in color features all of the members of the quartet in sort of a Southern, like almost plantation style. It's actually a photo from Los Angeles, but you know. And then we have Southern Scene, the second one that's released, where Eugene Wright is literally centered in the image and surrounded by his white bandmates. So it's a sort of clear reminder of his protest and of his sort of ideological stance that he needed Eugene Wright in this quartet. Throughout the 1950s, Brubeck's bassists were typically the least featured members of the quartet. They had the least solos. They sort of performed, they were just the least known. In fact, there were sort of 2 brothers that played bass, and they frequently sort of got mistaken which one was actually in the quartet at which time. Therefore, his decision to feature Wright prominently on these albums in the music, particularly on the songs Old Man River and Happy Times, which was actually composed by Eugene Wright, is remarkable and sort of represents his most explicit attempt to highlight Wright's musical contribution within the quartet directly to Southern audiences. So for those in the know, these songs were sort of moments of sonic integration. And for those who were somehow not in the know after seeing the album cover, the album could demonstrate Brubeck's colorblind approach to music, in which white and Black musicians could really cross the sonic color line. In these, Brubeck also not only highlighted Eugene Wright's musical contributions, but also emphasized the qualities of his personality that anyone, even audiences outside the music business, would understand as valuable character traits. So these are in the liner notes that Brubeck wrote for Happy Times, the piece that Eugene Wright wrote. And it sort of offers listeners a chance to hear Wright's composition, but also to sort of get to know Eugene Wright. So he maps the easygoing and upbeat theme of Happy Times onto Eugene Wright's personality. And I'm going to play just a little bit of this. And this really it really only features Eugene Wright. Still, the mixing on the audio is a little bit, you have to kind of pay close attention to the bass. The bass is a hard instrument to hear, but here is Happy Times. I have one more musical example to go to show you. So Southern Scene also features a duet between Brubeck and Eugene Wright, and this is a moment that perhaps underscores Brubeck's personal support of Eugene Wright. So this is, he kind of, Brubeck again explains how it came to be that this was a duet and not a quartet feature. And it has everything to do with sort of, oh, Eugene Wright has these wonderful character traits that everyone should appreciate. He shows up early to rehearse and no one else was there yet. This is not something he does with Paul Desmond and with Joe Morello either. He'll talk about them and share sort of personal anecdotes, but he does not sort of give these like positive character traits with that. So what results in this piece that I'll play for you, it's a piece called At the Darktown Strutter's Ball. It's a kind of old time jazz feel, kind of almost a little ragtime kind of feel. And you get a really steady bass line from Eugene Wright. You get Brubeck playing really heavy block chords, so just really heavy-handed from Brubeck. Midway through the song, and that's about where I start this example, Brubeck's left hand is going to play really strong offbeat chords. It's going to kind of obscure the beat and then eventually sort of rush wildly ahead of the beat. Like it feels like you've lost the beat. But what keeps you there, what holds you, is the steadiness of Eugene Wright's bass line. And so it grounds both Brubeck and us as a listener. It gives us a reliable home base. Brubeck is sort of threatening to upend the balance and the tempo of the song, but Wright gives that stability and makes space for Brubeck to kind of do his own thing. So I'm going to go ahead and play At the Darktown Strutter's Ball. We're starting again halfway through. Kind of a white knuckle kind of piece with that one. So for jazz critics who reviewed the album, they sort of complimented the quartet's musical integration, and they were very kind of thinly veiled compliments for the group's racial integration. And they specifically would point out Eugene Wright and kind of compliment him as well. So the reception of these albums sort of suggests that Brubeck's attempts to market integration and particularly in demonstrating the essential role that Eugene Wright fulfilled in the quartet may have been to some degree successful, at least to already sympathetic audiences. And I'm going to wrap things up because I know that I've gone a little bit over. As Brubeck navigated early civil rights protests, he worked to find an approach that suited his image and his career, which he, his wife Iola Brubeck, his managers, record producers, and advertisers had cultivated for nearly a decade. The result was a new musical and promotional approach for Brubeck, and one that leveraged his whiteness to support integration efforts in the South. With the growing visibility of his concert cancellations, Brubeck became emboldened, and his indignation with policymakers at Southern colleges and universities met the white rage of the segregationists protesting his performances. As Wynton Marsalis once said, Brubeck is important because he stood up for civil rights when many of us sat down. As a white man, Brubeck was able to simultaneously voice his anger and maintain a non-threatening image in ways that, as Marsalis implies, Black protesters typically couldn't access. Ultimately, this period in Brubeck's career is important because it allows deep consideration of his privilege as an activist, particularly regarding who he spoke for and who he spoke over, who listened, and for whom his actions as a civil rights advocate were meaningful. And as the book explains in more detail, Brubeck was not the perfect anti-racist activist because there is no perfect anti-racist activist. There is some discomfort in some of the situations in which he placed Eugene Wright and the ease with which he seems to have spoken for and over Wright at times, among other issues. There's also discomfort in the amount of praise Brubeck received as a white man who didn't necessarily need to contribute to the civil rights movement, compared with the heightened expectations faced by Black musicians. As with other white band leaders at mid-century, Brubeck's assumed heroism within the context of the civil rights movement reflects the cultural capital granted to white anti-racists of the period, a cultural capital that did not demand measurable outcomes or policy changes, and that bestowed a privilege of heroism not granted to Black musicians. At the same time, Brubeck's advocacy relied on his power and his privilege within the mainstream music industry to craft albums and marketing approaches that amplified the music and beliefs of the African Americans with whom he had grown close. And in doing so, he harnessed his white image, all of those intellectual, respectable elements that had made him so appealing to white critics and audiences in the 1950s, in order to once again try to bring new audiences to jazz and to his own music in the segregationist South. And that is all that I have for us today. So yeah, thank you for being here. Yeah, thanks, John.
Do you have time for a question or two if anyone has?
Sure. Yeah.
So if anyone has a question, I can use the raise hand feature in the reactions tab or type it into the chat and we will be able to see it. When we spoke 2 years ago, I think it was, for the interview we did, one of the things that I loved seeing was the student reaction to there was a letter in particular. So maybe you could just kind of touch on that, because I know the women's fan letters were new to me, but I think it shows a little bit into the insight of how the colleges were operating.
Yeah, so the University of Georgia in 1959, the student group, it's a brand new jazz student organization, and this is like I think the first concert they were going to have was they were bringing Brubeck in. Like, what a catch, right? So they get the promotional materials about a month out, and the student who's in charge sort of sees this and kind of goes, oh no, because just 2 years prior, the University of Georgia had passed a rule saying that you couldn't have any integrated groups. And this was as a direct result of the Little Rock immigration crisis. So he tries in like the limited way that the student can. And then what happens is, news of the cancellation happens and everyone knows why it has to be canceled. And so the student newspaper has several issues of sort of letters to the editor of folks writing in on both sides of this issue. So we had one student, there was one student who was particularly like fired up. Like, you could just imagine sort of the steam coming out of his ears saying like, how dare you bring an integrated group or try to bring an integrated group? This is just awful. The streets would run crazy with people protesting. Like, this is irresponsible. And like, it doesn't matter how good you say this music is, it can't be good if it's an integrated group. Just really just vitriolic in the response. And then sort of the pro, and then there were pro responses that were sort of like, oh no, like we should, they were more about like, we have the autonomy to be able to decide for ourselves as students if we can handle an integrated group. So yes, we can handle an integrated group. Like, we have this is not going to like brainwash us one way or the other. It doesn't really matter. It was sort of like a mini, almost like states' rights argument that like we students should have the right to choose this. So the reactions were, very interesting in what these students felt just so strongly about what was going on.
Well, thank you for that. And Barbara Phillips says, or maybe it's Phipps, that thank you so much. I grew up listening to them, a favorite of mine, father and the Modern Jazz Quartet. And I know that my parents had Brubeck records, and then I went to the store and bought Modern Jazz Quartet records. And like Brubeck is the gateway into the modern jazz.
And that's certainly something like Brubeck actually does take credit, and I think rightly so, but he does take credit for helping people find the modern jazz quartet, that he was a gateway to them. And he was also a gateway to sort of, he started the whole touring college campuses thing, and then the modern jazz quartet sort of followed and did sort of more limited college tours. And he specifically says, yeah, I did the college tours and then the modern jazz quartet did college tours. So that relationship is pretty tight, and the musicians sort of know it too. Yeah.
Would colleges allow full African-American bands to play, or was it just because it was segregated, or did they not?
They would often, so it sort of depended, but they would often let, as long as the group was not integrated, they would kind of let all Black performers come. I mean, some of them wouldn't, but some of them would. They would just have this one rule, like East Carolina College specifically was, you can't have integrated groups. And I think that UGA was as well. And then there were other ones where maybe the college wouldn't let it, but like fraternities would have different rules. Then they could kind of skirt around that way, if the fraternity had that amount of money, which they seems like they fairly often actually did. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this. And there will be a recording of the presentation probably within a week or so. So people who would like to share it with friends and relatives and loved ones will have that. Oh, yes, we have one more question. Why did he focus on college tours?
Oh, that's such a great question. So this was actually a brainchild of his wife, Iola Brubeck. So when he started the quartet in the early 1950s, they were just really struggling to get started and really struggling to make a living. And he had at this point at least 2 children. So really trying to support the family. And so she just came up with this idea that, I bet like colleges would be interested in having a jazz musician. And for her, she specifically said, would be interested in having like an intelligent jazz musician come and perform. So she wrote to every college within driving distance and asked, would you like to have a jazz group come and play? And they started making a touring schedule off of that. And so they were located in sort of the San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland area at that point. So, and they just gradually grew that circle out bigger and bigger and bigger. And then by the time he signed with his booking company, they just took that model that Iola Brubeck had already started and continued it across the country. And the idea there was that there were a couple ideas. One was that this was a young audience that probably was soon to be very marketable, that they would go into careers and have money to spend on albums. So that was one. The second was that there were all of these jazz clubs, but Brubeck would talk about how these jazz clubs, they have this sort of seedy reputation, and also like teenagers can't go to them. And he was like, I think I have a bunch of teenagers who would want to hear me. And so he wanted to find venues that specifically like would attract, again, new audiences to jazz, and that then broadened that audience base as well. So again, more people, more interest, more album buyers. Yeah.